In the town halls and voting booths of America, a fundamental question emerges: what transforms mere political participation into genuine democratic citizenship? During my years developing the critical system in Königsberg, I discovered that political freedom without moral foundation becomes mere license, while moral duty without political expression remains incomplete. Today's democratic challenges, from polarization to civic disengagement, reveal a deeper crisis: the separation of politics from rational moral principles. Can a democracy survive when citizens pursue only private interests? Must political decisions pass the same universalizability test as personal moral choices? Through the categorical imperative, we can establish that democracy is not merely a system of government, but a moral project requiring citizens capable of rational self-legislation. The question facing America is whether its democratic institutions can cultivate the moral autonomy necessary for genuine self-governance, or whether democracy will degenerate into mere aggregation of competing interests without moral foundation. Chapter 1: The Moral Foundation of Democratic Authority. Political authority presents a fundamental paradox. How can rational beings subject themselves to laws while maintaining their moral autonomy? This question occupied my thoughts as I witnessed the tensions between enlightened governance and human freedom during my formative years in Königsberg. The solution lies in understanding that legitimate political authority must be self-imposed through rational consent, not external coercion imposed by force or manipulation. Democratic legitimacy emerges only when citizens participate as moral agents, not mere subjects responding to incentives or threats. When we vote or engage in civic life, we must ask the fundamental question: could I will this political principle to become universal law governing all rational beings? A democracy where citizens pursue only narrow self-interest violates the categorical imperative by treating the political system as mere means to private ends, rather than as a shared project of rational self-governance among equals. Consider how Americans approach taxation, regulation, or social programs in contemporary political discourse. If I support policies simply because they benefit me personally, lower taxes for my income bracket, regulations that harm my competitors, programs that serve my demographic, I treat fellow citizens as means to my advantage rather than as ends in themselves deserving equal moral consideration. But if I support policies because they could be universally legislated by rational beings concerned with justice and human dignity, I honor both my own autonomy and that of others. The insociable sociability of human nature, our tendency toward both conflict and cooperation, requires institutional frameworks that channel self-interest toward universal benefit. Democracy succeeds not by eliminating human selfishness, which would be both impossible and contrary to human nature, but by creating structures where rational moral agents can legislate universally valid principles despite their particular interests and circumstances. This is why democratic participation demands comprehensive moral education that goes far beyond civics instruction. Citizens must develop the capacity to think beyond immediate desires, to consider what principles could govern a community of free and equal persons, and to distinguish between legitimate interests that can be universally defended and mere preferences that cannot withstand rational scrutiny. Without this moral foundation, democracy inevitably degenerates into mere aggregation of preferences, losing its essential character as rational self-governance. Chapter 2: The Categorical Imperative in Political Decision-Making. When citizens enter the voting booth or engage in political discourse, they face the same fundamental test that governs all moral action: could I will this principle to become universal law without contradiction? This universalizability criterion transforms political participation from mere preference expression into moral legislation, elevating democracy above the level of sophisticated preference polling. Consider immigration policy debates that dominate American political discourse. If I support restrictions because they take our jobs or they burden our social services, I apply a principle I could not universalize without logical contradiction: that people should exclude others to protect their economic advantages or social benefits. This creates a fundamental inconsistency. If everyone acted on this maxim, no one could ever migrate for better opportunities, including the ancestors of current Americans who immigrated for precisely these economic and social reasons. But if I support immigration policies based on principles like every person deserves consideration for legal pathways to improve their life circumstances, or nations should balance humanitarian obligations with practical capacity for social integration, these principles can be universally legislated without contradiction. They respect human dignity while acknowledging legitimate practical constraints that any rational society must consider. The universalizability test reveals the moral inadequacy of much contemporary political rhetoric across the ideological spectrum. Partisan positions often fail this test spectacularly when subjected to rigorous analysis. It's acceptable when our party gerrymanders districts, but wrong when theirs does, cannot be universalized without destroying the concept of fair electoral representation itself. Similarly, government surveillance is justified when it targets our political opponents but oppressive when it might affect our supporters, violates basic principles of equal treatment under law. Consider approaches to government transparency and accountability. Supporting open records and congressional investigations when they might embarrass political opponents while opposing them when they might embarrass allies violates universalizability in the most obvious way. A rational principle might be, government processes should be transparent and accountable except when legitimate security, privacy, or deliberative concerns apply, regardless of which party controls power or benefits from disclosure. This rigorous application of moral reasoning to politics doesn't eliminate legitimate disagreement. Rational people can and will differ on complex policy questions while sharing commitment to universalizable principles. But it does eliminate purely strategic or self-serving political positions that cannot withstand rational scrutiny when examined through the lens of universal moral law. Chapter 3: Human Dignity and Democratic Equality. The second formulation of the categorical imperative, treat humanity, whether in your own person or that of another, always as an end and never merely as means, provides the indispensable moral foundation for democratic equality. Every citizen possesses inherent dignity as a rational being capable of moral self-determination, regardless of their economic status, education level, race, gender, or political affiliation. This principle challenges both historical and contemporary failures of American democracy with uncompromising clarity. When the founders excluded women, enslaved people, and indigenous populations from political participation, they violated this fundamental requirement by treating entire groups as means to the political ends of others, denying their rational agency and inherent moral worth. These exclusions cannot be justified by appeals to tradition, practical convenience, or cultural norms. They represent clear violations of human dignity. Today's democratic challenges often stem from similar violations of human dignity, though sometimes in more subtle forms. Voter suppression tactics that make voting difficult for certain demographic groups treat citizens as obstacles to political power rather than as ends in themselves deserving equal participation in democratic self-governance. Gerrymandering treats voters as means to partisan advantage, manipulating their votes to achieve predetermined outcomes rather than respecting their agency as political decision-makers capable of authentic choice. Consider how this principle applies to contemporary debates about criminal justice reform. A system that imprisons people primarily to satisfy public desire for retribution treats offenders merely as means to emotional satisfaction, using their suffering as instruments for others' psychological needs. But a system focused on rehabilitation, protection of public safety, and restoration of civic participation treats even wrongdoers as rational beings capable of moral growth and eventual reintegration into democratic community. The dignity principle also illuminates economic inequality's profound threat to democratic governance. When vast concentrations of wealth allow some citizens to purchase disproportionate political influence through campaign contributions, lobbying, and media ownership, while others cannot afford basic civic participation costs like time off work to vote or transportation to polling places, the democratic system treats citizens differently based on their economic value rather than their inherent dignity as rational agents. This analysis doesn't mandate absolute economic equality, which might violate other important principles of freedom and desert. But it does require that basic civic participation, voting, running for office, accessing courts, obtaining education necessary for informed citizenship, participating in public discourse, remain accessible to all regardless of economic status. Democracy must honor the rational agency of every citizen, not just those with economic power or social connections. Recognizing every citizen's inherent dignity as an end in themselves fundamentally transforms political discourse from zero-sum competition between interest groups to collaborative moral legislation among equal rational beings united by shared humanity. Chapter 4: Goodwill and Political Motivation. The purity of motivation matters as much in politics as in personal morality, perhaps even more so given the broader consequences of political action. Acting from duty rather than inclination distinguishes genuine civic virtue from mere political calculation, and this distinction proves crucial for understanding what makes democratic participation morally valuable rather than simply strategically effective. Many political actions that appear virtuous on the surface actually spring from self-interested motives when examined more carefully. A politician who supports education funding because it wins votes from teacher unions and suburban parents acts according to duty but not from duty. Their action may produce beneficial consequences for students and society, but it lacks moral worth because it serves personal political advancement rather than principled commitment to educational justice and human development. Contrast this with a politician who supports education funding because they recognize that every child deserves opportunities to develop their rational capacities and moral agency, even when this position proves politically costly in their district due to anti-tax sentiment or competing budget priorities. This action springs from duty, from recognition of what universal moral law requires regarding human development and equal opportunity, rather than from calculation about political advantage or career advancement. Citizens face similar challenges in distinguishing duty-based from inclination-based political engagement in their own civic participation. Supporting candidates because they promise personal benefits like tax cuts, favorable regulations, or targeted spending that serves your community or demographic group differs morally from supporting those whose principles could be universally legislated by rational beings concerned with justice. The first approach treats politics as a market where outcomes can be purchased through votes, while the second respects the political process as shared moral legislation among equals. Consider how Americans approach political donations and lobbying activities. Giving money to influence policy toward personal business interests treats the democratic process as a commodity market where legislative outcomes can be purchased by the highest bidder. But supporting organizations that advocate for principles you believe should govern society universally, civil rights, environmental protection, constitutional governance, human dignity, expresses moral commitment rather than mere self-interest or profit maximization. This analysis doesn't condemn all self-interested political participation, which would be both unrealistic and potentially harmful to legitimate democratic representation. Citizens legitimately advocate for their community's needs and interests, and representatives appropriately serve their constituents' concerns. But moral political engagement requires that these particular interests align with universalizable principles that respect human dignity. Advocating for rural development funding because rural communities deserve equal opportunity for prosperity and human flourishing differs morally from advocating for agricultural subsidies simply because you personally profit from higher commodity prices. The goodwill in politics manifests as commitment to justice and human dignity even when such commitment proves costly to personal, financial, or partisan interests. Chapter 5: Freedom and Responsibility in Democratic Citizenship. Democratic participation embodies the fundamental tension between freedom and determinism that occupies the center of moral philosophy and practical reason. As citizens, we must simultaneously acknowledge the powerful causal forces shaping political behavior while insisting on our capacity for rational moral choice in civic life that transcends these determining influences. Social pressures, economic interests, tribal loyalties, family traditions, and media influences certainly affect political behavior in powerful and often unconscious ways. Yet democracy presupposes that citizens can transcend these determining factors through rational reflection on universal principles of justice and human dignity. Without this freedom to choose based on moral reasoning rather than mere causal determination, democratic participation becomes nothing more than sophisticated mechanical response to stimuli rather than genuine moral legislation among rational agents. Consider how partisan identity often functions as a determining force in contemporary American politics, operating almost like a natural law. Citizens increasingly adopt policy positions simply because their preferred party endorses them, without independent moral reasoning about the principles involved. This represents a form of political heteronomy, allowing external authorities to determine our political judgments rather than exercising the rational autonomy that defines human dignity and makes democracy possible. Genuine democratic citizenship requires what I call political enlightenment, the courage to use your own understanding in civic matters rather than simply following the guidance of political authorities, media figures, or social groups. This means questioning party talking points against universal moral principles, examining policy proposals through the lens of human dignity and justice, and sometimes supporting positions that conflict with tribal loyalties when rational analysis demands it. The responsibility that accompanies this freedom proves equally demanding and cannot be avoided through appeals to ignorance or social pressure. If citizens possess rational capacity for moral political judgment, and democracy assumes they do, then they bear genuine responsibility for the collective consequences of their choices. Voting purely from self-interest, remaining deliberately ignorant about public issues that affect others' lives, or supporting demagogues who appeal to fear and hatred rather than reason and dignity, these choices carry profound moral weight because they affect not only ourselves but the entire political community and future generations. This responsibility extends far beyond voting to encompass all forms of civic engagement that shape democratic culture. How we discuss politics with neighbors and family members, what sources we choose for political information and whether we verify their reliability, whether we engage constructively or destructively in public discourse, how we treat political opponents in social settings. These choices collectively shape the moral character of democratic culture and determine whether democracy functions as rational self-governance or degenerates into tribal warfare. The freedom-responsibility nexus in democratic citizenship also illuminates why civic education matters so profoundly for any society aspiring to democratic governance. Citizens must develop capacities for rational moral judgment, understanding of constitutional principles, and deep appreciation for human dignity that transcends partisan divisions. Chapter 6: The Hope for Democratic Progress. While theoretical reason cannot prove that democracy will ultimately succeed in realizing human freedom and dignity, practical reason demands that we act as if such progress remains possible and work toward it with sustained effort. This rational hope provides the foundation for sustained civic engagement despite inevitable frustrations, setbacks, and the slow pace of institutional change. My concept of history as gradual realization of human freedom through institutional development finds particular expression in democratic evolution. American democracy, with all its historical failures and contemporary contradictions, represents humanity's ongoing experiment in rational self-governance by free and equal persons. Each generation faces the fundamental choice of advancing this project toward greater justice and inclusion or allowing it to deteriorate through moral complacency and civic disengagement. The postulates of practical reason, freedom, immortality, and God's existence as conditions for the possibility of moral life find political analogies in what we might call democratic faith. We must postulate human capacity for moral progress despite evidence of persistent selfishness and tribalism, believe in the possibility that present injustices can be overcome through sustained effort and institutional reform, and maintain that rational principles ultimately provide better guidance for political life than mere power struggles or interest group competition. Consider how this hope operates when confronting contemporary American political challenges that might otherwise justify despair or withdrawal. Racial injustice, economic inequality, environmental degradation, and democratic backsliding present overwhelming problems that individual citizens seem powerless to solve. Yet practical reason demands continued effort toward justice because the alternative, abandoning hope for moral progress and retreating into private life, would violate our duty to treat humanity as capable of rational improvement and collaborative problem solving. This doesn't require naive optimism about inevitable progress or blind faith that things automatically improve over time. History clearly shows how easily democratic institutions can decay when citizens abandon moral responsibility for collective self-governance. Weimar Germany's collapse into fascism, various nations' retreats from democracy into authoritarianism, and America's own historical periods of democratic regression demonstrate that progress is neither automatic nor irreversible. But neither does realistic assessment of these dangers permit cynical withdrawal from civic engagement or nihilistic rejection of moral principles in politics. The categorical imperative requires political participation aimed at universal justice, regardless of whether immediate success seems probable or whether our individual contributions appear significant in the larger scheme of social change. The hope for democratic progress also fundamentally guides how we approach political opposition and disagreement in pluralistic society. Rather than viewing opponents as enemies to be defeated through any means necessary, rational hope suggests treating them as fellow citizens capable of responding to moral reasoning and evidence when presented respectfully and clearly. This doesn't mean compromising fundamental principles of human dignity or justice, but it does mean engaging across difference with respect for others' rational capacity and possibility of mutual understanding through dialogue. Chapter 7: Applying Kantian Political Ethics to Contemporary American Challenges. Contemporary American democracy faces unprecedented challenges that test whether citizens can apply rational moral principles to complex political questions involving technology, globalization, and social change. From campaign finance reform to social media's effect on public discourse, modern circumstances require fresh application of eternal moral principles to novel situations. Campaign financing presents perhaps the clearest case for applying the categorical imperative to institutional design. Current systems often allow wealthy donors and corporations to purchase disproportionate political influence through unlimited contributions, treating democracy as a market rather than a community of equal citizens. Could we universalize the principle, those with more money should have greater political influence in determining laws and policies? This would create a society where political power depends entirely on wealth accumulation, destroying democracy's foundation in equal dignity and replacing it with plutocracy. Alternative principles like all citizens should have equal opportunity to participate meaningfully in political processes, or campaign funding should enable informed public debate rather than private influence buying, can be universalized without contradiction and better respect human dignity. These principles suggest reforms like public campaign financing, contribution limits, and transparency requirements that level the playing field without suppressing legitimate political speech. Social media's transformative impact on political discourse reveals how technology can either enhance or fundamentally undermine democratic moral culture. Platforms that reward outrage over understanding, spread misinformation faster than truth, and create echo chambers that prevent genuine dialogue treat users as means to advertising revenue rather than as rational agents capable of informed political judgment. citizens who share false information without verification, engage in cruel personal attacks on political opponents, or deliberately spread conspiracy theories violate duties both to truth and to human dignity. Applying Kantian principles suggests supporting platform designs that promote informed dialogue rather than engagement addiction, fact-checking mechanisms that enhance rather than restrict legitimate debate, and personal practices that honor the rational capacity of fellow citizens even during intense disagreement. The universalizability test helps distinguish legitimate political criticism from destructive behavior that undermines democratic discourse itself. Immigration policy debates illustrate how universal principles can guide complex practical decisions involving competing moral claims. The principle, every person deserves consideration for opportunities to improve their life circumstances and escape persecution, must be balanced with, political communities have legitimate authority to regulate membership and ensure sustainable social cooperation. Both principles can be universalized while requiring practical wisdom in application through immigration systems that respect human dignity while maintaining social cohesion. Climate change policy presents perhaps the most challenging test of democratic moral reasoning in our era. Could we universalize the principle, each generation may consume resources and emit pollutants according to immediate economic interests regardless of consequences for future generations? This clearly violates duties to future persons who will inherit the environmental and social consequences of our political choices, treating them merely as means to present convenience rather than as ends deserving moral consideration. Instead, principles like, current generations should leave future generations equal or better opportunities for human flourishing, provide moral guidance while allowing legitimate debate about specific policies, technological solutions, and timelines for implementation that balance urgent environmental needs with economic disruption concerns. Conclusion. The marriage of ethics and politics through rational moral principles offers America's democracy its best hope for renewal amid the polarization and cynicism that threaten self-governance today. Citizens equipped with moral reasoning can transform political participation from mere preference aggregation into genuine collective self-governance by free and equal persons united by shared commitment to human dignity. The categorical imperative provides powerful tools for evaluating political positions beyond partisan loyalty. The dignity principle demands equal respect for every citizen's rational agency regardless of their views. And good will motivate civic engagement based on universal justice rather than narrow self-interest or tribal affiliation. These principles don't eliminate legitimate political disagreement. Rational people will continue to differ on complex policy questions while sharing commitment to universalizable moral foundations. Most importantly, this philosophical framework offers genuine hope that political progress remains possible through citizens' sustained commitment to rational moral principles in public life. Each vote cast from duty rather than mere inclination. Each political conversation conducted with respect for human dignity across difference. Each policy supported because it could be universally legislated by rational beings. These actions contribute to democracy's gradual realization of human freedom and moral community. The question facing American democracy is whether enough citizens will embrace the demanding work of moral citizenship that requires both political engagement and moral reflection. This demands not just participation but participation guided by reason, duty, and unwavering respect for the inherent worth of every human being as an end in themselves.